In progress.
Good afternoon. Today is Monday, December 5th, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our work session. Members present in the boardroom are members Wilson, Jacobs, Holloman, and Donley. I know I did get a call from member Lessons. She is on her way. So we will update the roll call when she gets here. We also have Dr. Bryant, and we have our staff that will guide us through this work session. So now let's look at our RFIs that are remaining on our list. Oh, and member Higgins just joined us. So while she's pulling that up, board members have access to information via our RFI process. That process is in our bylaws and procedures for the school board. Once those are submitted, we try to answer what is quickly answered in our Board Connect. Those items that might take more administrative time come to before us during our work session for prioritization and updates from the administration. So that is where we are. All right. So the first one, controversial issue, concerns committee. There was a response to this in the Board Connect, but we have gotten more questions from member Donley on the information that he is requesting. Where are we, Dr. Bryant?
Yes, we would be able to provide this in the short term in an upcoming Board Connect. Okay. Member Donley, is that,
First of all, I forgot, I didn't even ask if anybody else was interested. I think member Lessons was interested, but she's not here. Okay. Is there anyone else that's interested in the controversial issues committee information? So if it's going in, hold on, if I can continue. If the information is going in Board Connect, it will be there for everybody to see. And it's a continuation of a prior question. So we've already started our input on this particular item. Now, member Donley, did you have a comment, question?
Well, I think this is incredibly important to the school district. We have a controversial concerns committee, but currently there's nobody on it, is what I was advised. It doesn't exist. And yet we have pending parental appeals and matters that have been there since before April of this year.
Okay, so it's my understanding that this year's committee applications were due November 28th of this year. Each year there's a new committee. And if you recall, we made some internal shifts in when we moved Dr. Knudsen to a different role, and we brought on Dr. Beltran. So that is in process. So I don't know that those members have been selected since the 28th, but that's when this year's committee was actually, those applications were due.
Well, that begs the question, Madam President, as that's a broken system. I mean, if we have a pending appeal that dates back before April of this year, but we haven't been able to address it because it appears on the website.
Yes, we have. There's one book that's still there.
There's got to be a way to get a committee formed quicker than we're going on 8 months now.
Okay, points taken. Personally, that would not be at the top of my list in the midst of all the things that we're having to do. But your point is well taken. Member Higgins.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, let the record show that Member Lessons has joined us safely. All right. So, Dr. Bryant, just to reiterate what you just said, you said that, could you just repeat what you said?
Right. Given that there's interest in this information, we would be able to produce it in the short term, likely in the next Board Connect on Friday.
All right. Thank you very much. Moving on to the next question. And that question is from Member Donnelly. A concern arose at a recent board meeting that the parent read from a book in the school library some very offensive language, but that policy provision does not currently appear on the ASD website. When will the district put the complete meeting public, I'm sorry, my vision, testimony policy on the website? It is on the website, Member Donnelly. What was not on the website was the blue and white sheet that I shared with you earlier, but we have added that to the website.
So what was lacking was the portion of the policy that's available to the public at the door, but did not appear on the website. That was the basis for the acting chair's ruling that individual out of order that night on the basis of obscene and objectionable or obscene language, which was being read directly from a book that was in one of our libraries. So are you saying that we've now added that additional criteria to the website?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Moving on, next one, please. The health curriculum, I believe. Oh, budget, sorry. So what is that? Member Donnelly, what consideration has been given to larger university-sized classes for high school required courses? I think we addressed that when we met jointly with the Assembly. Were you satisfied with that answer?
I'm still supportive of exploring that as a cost-saving option, Madam President. The answers at the, we had limited time at that Assembly joint meeting to deal with that, but the answers tend to imply that there wasn't sufficient space in our high schools or junior high schools to do such a thing. But we have multi-purpose rooms and auditoriums in every high school. I mean, it seems like they're identical to what rooms that I took biology 101 in and econ 101 in college. So I was puzzled why that we wouldn't have space for it if we have those auditoriums available in every high school.
Well, Dr. Bryant, I mean, I have my own thoughts, but did you want to?
I can just restate some of the statements that were made in the joint assembly meeting. There are some practical considerations with the availability of those large spaces, such as classes that may be taking place in the auditorium. So for a system-wide budget solution, it wouldn't be likely that would be a part of the budget solution, but it could be a programmatic choice that a school could implement if that were of interest to them.
Okay. So I don't know that there is another, so I think I don't know what other information to give you other than that, Member Donnelly. But if you want to ask that question again at a future date when we are to see if any schools are implementing that. I mean, I'm a product of those huge class sizes. I hated them personally because I got lost. And that was not a very memorable portion of my education, but it could be different for other people who are maybe more self-directed.
Well,
all right.
Madam Chair.
Sure.
Yeah, it's not something that I would look at as being something we want to do, but I do think it could potentially be utilized to help hold down class sizes in the kinds of classes that need more direct instruction and more one-on-one help for our students.
Okay.
There are some courses that lend themselves to more of a lecture format than a one-on-one instructional format. And I think it could be a cost-saving option that we could undertake to preserve the smaller sizes in those classes that are needed, where one-on-one instruction is more needed.
Okay. Thank you, Member Donnelly. Okay, so in terms of a priority, to come back to that, I would say probably long range for right now. Any opposition to long range? Thank you. All right, our next one, we still have about 3 more to go. And this is a health curriculum question. Dr. Bryant, did you want to speak to this one? Again, Member Donnelly's state law requires health curriculum be available to parents. And I thought we answered this in Board Connect, but I know we answered because it was a situation that came up earlier this year. Did you want to add anything to what was in Board Connect?
Correct. I believe we answered this question previously. If there are other aspects that we can answer, we'd be happy to understand what that additional request would be.
So the thing that I think is new, that might be new this time is requesting a copy of the current approved health, sex education curriculum and all other sex education health curriculum being used by individual teachers that has not been approved by the district or the school board. Did you want to speak to that, Member Duncan?
Thank you, Madam President. We had emails from some parents who were concerned about a survey or emails they received from specific instructors that, although they didn't say it in a certain way, they implied that those parents would have to opt out of a particular sex education class being taught, and which of course is a violation of state law. The state law requires that parents opt in to such curriculum and not have to opt out. And I was concerned that it certainly seemed to be misleading what was communicated to parents, at least by that specific instructor. And additionally, I had requested to see what our current approved sex education curriculum is and whether we're allowing instructors to develop their own individual curriculum that hasn't been approved by the board.
So I think, is there any other board member interested in more information on the health curriculum? If not, I would recommend that Member Donnelly meet with with the appropriate staff to get his specific questions answered. I think that would be a better way to move forwards. Thank you. Next. Member Jacobs, did you want to speak to your request? What is an estimated savings for the following? Wage freeze for any non-represented and exempt employee making $55,800 or more, a 1 and 2 week unpaid furlough for any non-represented and exempt employee making $55,800 or more. Did you want to speak to your request? And then we'll go to Dr. Bryant.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. This was a topic I touched on during our special meeting regarding PTR and admin cuts. I think this is a data point that will be useful as we work to put the puzzle pieces together as to how we eliminate our budget deficits, whether it be 68 million or less. I've connected with staff and had a couple subsequent conversations since, and I understand that there will be some limitations and caveats on the data that is presented in response to this inquiry, but it's still, I think, a relevant point that the board should consider as we navigate the weeks and months ahead. Thank you.
Okay, is there other board members interested in this data? Member Higgins.
I just want to add, I think everything's on the table. And if a board member sees something where there's potential savings and we want to get a figure for it, I support that, because not that I think this is necessarily the best idea or not, but everything on the table makes sense. So I just think that should be responsive, and I support it for that reason.
Thank you. Member Donnelly, did you have?
I agree with that.
All right, thank you. Dr. Bryant.
We would be able to produce this figure both in the Board Connect and also for discussion potentially at our Saturday work session.
Okay, is that good, Member Jacobs.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I just want to second the comments of Member Higgins is that I'm still waiting, months after we've started our budget process, I'm still waiting for the first painless or an idea that we would implement were we not facing a $60 million deficit. So this is no exception. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think our last one, is that correct? Member Lessons, Member Lessons and I had a conversation earlier at the School Board Association during a work session. And I'll let her speak to her request, but this is information that she would like, that she feels is very important, and I actually agree, might be useful when we meet with legislators. We did not have it ready for our luncheon, but we should be able to have it for February.
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this. I did appreciate at the legislative luncheon, there was an initial outline helping me, certainly, and hopefully helping legislators, board members, assembly members in attendance understand with our new breakdown of districts, who is responsible for the schools in their districts. I would like incoming legislators to really understand the metrics at their schools. What do things look like now? What would things look like down the road? If, class sizes, PTR needs to increase. I want them to understand as much as possible about their constituents and about the conditions that we need in the district to promote student growth. And I think information can be powerful. So I would hope to be able to meet with a legislator and say, this is what is happening on the ground right now. If you don't increase the base student allocation, this is what it may look like next year.
And I guess my question is, in terms of time, Dr. Bryant, can we do this by February?
I would aim for a early to mid-February deadline for this. We will need some time to gather the data and make sure that it's packaged by region and by district, but it is something that could aid us in our advocacy efforts.
And thank you. And I would just add, this is not an exclusive list. This was a back of the napkin brainstorm session that we had at the AASB, but also that the legislative fly-in, the first one is the first weekend in February. So that could be a good target point.
All right. So that would be short term for February. All right. That concludes our list of our RFIs. Continue to encourage the board to send in your questions so we can answer what we can immediately and forward the others that might take a little more time, forward those to the body for consideration. All right, that brings us to item item C is our budget update and discussion. Dr. Bryant?
Thank you, Madam President. Good afternoon, board and ASD community. We'll continue our discussion of budget solutions as the time to make decisions inches near. CFO Jim Anderson will walk through the revenue impact of school closures over 5 years and provide the board with an update on changes to revenue since we last calculated our projections. So for the public's understanding, the district budgets in advance for a certain number of staff, such as teachers, etc., and systemic issues such as chronic vacancies result in greater fund balance if positions remain unfilled. Additionally, the per student revenue from the state is always a projection until final enrollment is verified by the state, as well as verification of which students are classified as having intensive needs, which are students that are able to generate higher levels of revenue per the foundation formula. The board will see an updated fund balance, which is one potential lever to address the deficit. Then Andy and Jim will walk through the annual pro forma presentation, which summarizes projected revenue and expenditures for the next year. And lastly, we'll provide a preview of an activity plan for our Saturday special work session. We've heard board feedback that there is a desire to see how different budget solutions fit together in the bigger pictures, such as structural expenditures versus one-time funds versus cost avoidance strategies, et cetera, et cetera. The purpose of our activity will not be for each individual board member to decide their ideal path forward on Saturday, but really it'll equip us all to visualize a wide variety of scenarios and for the board to ask questions that could help inform your decision going into our next board meeting in later December. So in summary, in closing, until there's a structural change to school finance in Alaska, such as a BSA increase, we will need to strike a fine balance between using one-time funding versus making changes that will structurally decrease our expenditures for the long term. And unfortunately, one-time funding is not a reliable stream of revenue, and historically it is allocated to districts after a balanced budget is passed. So with that, I will hand it off to CFO Jim Anderson.
Thank you, Dr. Bryant. On the next slide, you'll see the fiscal cliff chart. We've been briefing for now almost a year, and with only one minor change, which was the BSA increase for fiscal year 24. What you'll see tonight is, if you go to the next slide, as we start talking about revenue changes since we did the original projection for the deficit in July. Obviously, since then, we've had the OASIS count, so we have new revenue. We've also seen significant numbers of vacancies that have continued, and Andy will be walking you through how those cost avoidance or cost savings measures have generated additional funding that could be available to apply towards the deficit. After the pro forma, he'll go through the fiscal year 23 projected fund balance. So every year in December, we brief the pro forma and the fund balance for the first time. And the reason that it is for the first time in December is that we really need 3 payroll runs to be able to do an accurate projection of what we may look like at the end of June. So he'll walk you through how those numbers have been playing out, what the projections are, potentially some level of risk. And then finally, we'll go through a summary of all the options that we've talked about repeatedly to achieve an overall or an FY24 balanced budget. So if you go to the next chart, I made these next 2 charts up.
Just the first slide that you have up there, the slide we're all seeing a lot of times. Madam President, it seems to me that the elephant in the room on this chart is the next fiscal year. Looking at what will happen going out one more fiscal year to FY25, there won't be the $220 million of one-time federal ESSER funds. And we'll also have an inflation rate that I think is greater than that line indicates there, probably a 7 or 8% official inflation rate, which we all know is a fiction. The actual inflation is much higher than that. So I think it would be very important we've heard at some town halls that the community said we didn't tell them this was coming. And I know that we've been talking about it here for years, but I'm just thinking that having a chart that showed just how bad FY25 would be a useful thing to get out to the community so that they couldn't say we didn't warn them of just how bad it's going to be. But I think the combination of a much higher inflation rate, loss of the ESSER funds, makes the next fiscal year really dramatically frightening.
And I tried to make a chart. There's a chart that this is the baseline at the very end of this brief, after we see available fund balance and the 16 million in one-time funds. And then I've modified that chart to show that in reality, that structural deficit, because of the use of one-time funds, although it makes the deficit that we have to target for building the fiscal year 24 budget a little bit smaller, it doesn't change the underlying fact, which is the structural deficit will still exist anytime one-time funds are used as the source. But I agree on fiscal year 25 that certainly for this next legislative session, that's worth rolling out, and to the public.
Let's
continue to track our questions, but let's get through the presentation.
Yes.
Or you tell us when it's a good pause for questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So if we go to the next slide, there's been a couple concerned citizens who've done remarkably good math to be able to show to themselves that the hold harmless formula does in fact end up at some point with less revenue. But the piece that was missing is what is the overall impact to the district if you close 6 schools? So if you look at this from top to bottom, you'll see that Abbott Loop, because we're recommending that it close and not, and potentially we get with the city and we declare that property as excess. It could be demoed, it could be taken by the city, it could be a lot of things, but it would be out of the district hands. That it never actually, even with the hold harmless formula, ever results in a negative. And that's really because of the number of staff that is no longer needed, permanent staff, and that's principal through custodian, nurse, librarian, and all those positions. As you go down to Birchwood ABC, and it's the same for the bulk of the schools where a charter school might come in, when they end up picking up all of the maintenance and utility costs, you see a similar trend to where you never really get to a negative delta despite how the formula plays itself out. When you go to CLAT, where we currently have no repurpose plan because Highland Academy has chosen, has decided that they do not want to move to that school, you'll see that at the very end, of course, it goes into the red slightly. And then on Nunaca Valley, where we would have an early childhood center potentially, we would have additional staff to man that center. And that's why you do see in the deficit on years 4 and 5. If you look to the right on each of these, I also put down what is the total 5-year savings to the district, because you're saving every single year that you don't have to come back into next year's budget and say, okay, Abbott Loop again, because once that decision is made, you're going to save for the next 5 years on Abbott Loop. As opposed to if we had kept the school open and if the same number of students would have been at Abbott Loop every year. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that Northwood, like Nunaca Valley, because the early childhood center does result in a negative, in Wonder Park, because it would go to a charter school, would really never go into the deficit. But the total package of closing all 6 schools, if that were to occur, the total savings over 5 years is $10.9 million. And I hope that that provides a different visual picture of the impact on revenue, instead of just taking one school and just looking at year 5. And on that year 5 saying, we've now lost money, but over a 5-year period, you're saving every single year to include year 5 if you look at this total package of 6 schools. Barring any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Member Donnelly?
Thank you. When it comes to Birchwood ABC, if the plan, which is to move the Birchwood ABC students in with another non-ABC school at this time, the problem with that is that ABC schools need a principal who's trained in ABC curriculum to be successful. So you're not going to be able to just chop out an ABC principal if you want to have a real legitimate ABC program in a non-ABC school. So does this take into account the additional costs that we're going to have to put into any school they move into to properly maintain the ABC format?
Thank you, Member Donnelly. The easy answer to that question is that we have many programs here that have multiple optional programs. And when we review principals and they come on board, they all have to learn those optional philosophies and they have to work with them all. I do not see a particular need to have 2 separate principals in that school. That doesn't mean there might not be a handoff over a couple of years of training the new principal in what ABC is, and there might be some needs for us to do some professional development and historical work with that principal. But we have many, many schools in the district that have split programs within them, sometimes more than one. And I can think of examples like West High School with IB curriculum running all the way through the high school. And so when you turn those principals over, they may or may not be experts in those things, but that is something to consider. And that is something, though, that we can work with without having to carry more than one principal for one elementary school.
Well, Madam President, as a parent at an ABC school for at least 7 years and being involved with the parent advisory council there, I just don't agree, Dr. Stock. You need a well-trained principal in ABC curriculum to make it a success. It's not something you can train somebody up over the next 3 years and have that program survive in any kind of efficacy. You got to have somebody who knows Spalding reading. You got to have somebody who supports Saxon math. The principals are out in the hallways coaching kids on the phonograms. I mean, it's an essential element of protecting the ABC ethos in that school. It's a whole different thing than a normal school. And they're taught patriotism, they're taught personal responsibility at a much higher degree than an average school. They open the door for the people that come in and out. It's very different than the culture we find. Now, when we had the non-ABC schools at Birchwood, there were issues. There were issues. And I think those issues even have carried over today, according to some parents, because of that lack of that same ethos, that same culture that was brought into that school at that time. Now, it was worked out, it was worked out, but there were still some lasting effects that I've heard from parents from that. And to reverse that and actually have the ABC school a subjugant and just a program within another school, I think is just devastating to the ABC ethos.
Okay, thank you, Member Donnelly. Member Jacobs and then Member Higgins.
Yeah, going on a different track, Mr. Anderson, during some of the community town halls, you've reiterated that it's understood that there's, due to the way the foundation formula is written, there's potentially lost income after year 5, and that isn't a secret, and that's why the whole harmless provision was added with the leadership from Senator von Imhoff. As a caveat to that, you indicated that the intention is potentially for efficiencies to be identified during that 5-year period, and that's how we'll mitigate that potential loss of income going forward. Has administration at least tentatively identified areas for efficiency, or is that a process that will begin after the cuts are made? I know that you've also talked about, due to flat funding since 2016, effectively, we've already implemented a number of efficiencies. And so each year it's getting harder to do so. So any feedback on that would be helpful.
So we've been working on efficiencies that will end up helping these schools out as well when it comes to the air handling units and the ability to automate those and increase airflow and maximize it through the buildings. We continue to increase LED lighting. There's a lot of things that we've been doing to increase efficiencies that we won't stop just because we're going to close or repurpose schools. We will continue to try to create more efficiencies in our system long term. Frankly, one thing that will help us with efficiencies, and several of the more senior board members understand, is sometimes it costs money to create an efficiency. And as we see how the legislature works through both the BSA long term over the next year or two, and as they look at the restoring bond debt reimbursement ratings, those will also help generate additional efficiencies. So I don't think there's a magic list of where we would start or stop at creating efficiencies.
Okay. Dr. Stock, you had a comment.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to let Mr. Donnelly know that I appreciate his passion for the ABC philosophy. It's actually a passion I personally share. What I would say, though, is that the Birchwood's current principal's been there less than 5 years, and he was trained in all the ABC pieces after he was hired. So it is something we can do, and it's something we routinely have to do for all our principals whenever they whenever they turn over and a new one is hired, it's difficult for us to find perfect principals that already come in with all the trainings for all the optional programs within their schools. And those are passions we have to make sure that they espouse when they're hired, and then we still have to train them. So I just wanted to make that point.
Okay. Member Jacobs, sorry, did you get your question answered? You good? Okay. Next in the queue, Member Higgins, and then Member Holloman.
Thank you. I think some of the complaints that are there is that in the future, the cuts that we make right now by closing schools will not be there. And I think that's a valid statement, even though overall over the 5 years, it results in a cut, but then we'll be in a deficit rather than a gain. And I think that's still a legitimate issue. But I think that Mr. Donnelly's raising the issue I think that we hope to address this Saturday, and that is let's not talk strictly about dollars. Let's talk about academic outcomes. Let's talk about the kids and not just the budget sheet and the impact. We're hearing things from a lot of people in regards to closures of schools, questions about kids going in 6th grade and the 7th if they don't have the true middle school model with the additional support from teachers with the staffing, how that works from a social, emotional, and an adjustment kind of basis, that they've kept it differently than that. So there's a lot of questions out there, but I appreciate the dollars and cents, but I don't think the issue that I've heard is not that there isn't savings initially. I don't think that I've heard that from the public, that they don't think that's the case. They just have argued that long term, it results in, it's a short term savings. And I think this document kind of supports that. The way this is being done. It's a short-term gain, and unless it's a benefit for academically, which I think we'll discuss this weekend, that's not much of the benefit is short-term is my only purpose. And like as Member Donnelly made reference, you look at 25 and years after that, the deficit is not going to get better unless they change things. So we're just pushing things further in the future. So it's a legitimate issue is all I'm saying.
Thank you. Member Holloman.
Yes, two things. One, to respond to Member Donnelly's comments, and not surprisingly coming at it from the other end of the spectrum, my son was in an open optional program for a number of years that was also co-housed in a neighborhood school. And it was very well handled. I don't think there really was a detriment to the program. They had one principal who was in charge of the whole school. And I think every educator I know really supports ABC as the right spot for the right kids. I don't think my son would do well there, although I'll never find out. But, open optional seemed to be the answer for him. I would support Dr. Stock in saying a good administrator can run several different programs like that. And there are numerous examples in our building. A lot of our immersion programs are inside of a neighborhood school. Like Narvik East is inside of a neighborhood high school, and I'm sure I don't know all of them, but it would mean that we need good oversight of our administrators and evaluation of whether or not they're doing their job effectively. I don't think it's impossible, and there are some friction points between a neighborhood school population and a special program population, but to some degree, I think those friction points are sort of educational opportunities that we deal with on a regular basis. My question, Mr. Anderson, is in the schools that we're talking about converting to early childhood centers, and I can completely understand the benefits of having a dedicated building where you have multiple sections of early childhood classes, but how does it compare if obviously in all but one case we have capacity in these buildings now? Can we add the early childhood component to bring numbers up in those buildings and still effectively run the program? If I ask that in a coherent way.
I think so. And I have asked our district expert to come and speak that instead of me.
So I stepped out to go to the bathroom real quickly, but could you just reframe that real quick? That way I can answer fully.
The question is from Member Holloman.
So right now what we're looking at is vacating a couple of buildings and creating early childhood centers in them. As I was saying, I understand the benefits of having a building dedicated to that one area. And in fact, I know a lot of people actually advocate we split elementary into upper and lower for kind of the same reasons. But in terms of possibly keeping them as neighborhood schools, does it still function reasonably well if we were to simply add more early childhood classes into those buildings that have capacity, have the room space and all to have more students in them?
Yes, to Member Holloman through the board. So that is how we're operating now. So what has been a challenge is finding space when we have had to expand over the last few years. Our expansion has been a little bit slower, more so on the gen ed than our special education side. But as our enrollment increased significantly about 4 and 5 years ago, it was more challenging to add to the neighborhood programs in regionally placed. We're in 35-ish elementary schools right now and 2 high schools, King Tech and Bartlett. And so it just depends on space, honestly, but it does function in that manner as long as we're functioning the best when we're not a single site by just adding 1 preschool classroom to a building, but being able to add multiple for the same reasons. Yeah.
Okay. Follow up?
Yeah, I guess as a follow-up, just I see a huge benefit to keeping these neighborhood schools as neighborhood schools. And I don't know the specifics of like how many rooms are available versus how many rooms you need in that area. I assume if we make these early childhood centers, they've got a different boundary that we're drawing students from than the elementary school does, or otherwise they'd be overflowing right now, I think. So I'm wondering if we can, I think we'd be providing transportation. I'm not certain. I'm just wondering if we can't utilize classrooms within those buildings. And I do understand it would be more complex and not as administratively simple, but it does seem like the payout is we maintain these as neighborhood schools. And that seems to be a huge benefit to me, personally. So I would ask that be looked at closely with a possible recommendation for trying to, in essence, utilize the space in those buildings completely by adding more early childhood without actually closing them down as neighborhood schools.
Thank you. Member Lessons?
Thank you. I have maybe 2 questions that are budget oriented, but on different topics. One, I wanted to better understand this slide in relation to what some of our community members have suggested. And, you know, I've seen a very detailed spreadsheet suggesting that there would be $4.5 million of revenue lost through consolidating. And yet here I'm hearing that we would be saving $10.9 million. And I just feel like I'm missing something.
So some of the community members may have a certain goal that they're trying to achieve, and they're probably looking at one and only one school and trying to show how that one school ends up being in a negative, but they're also possibly not looking at the revenues or the cost savings you get from repurposing the school and that amount that now is paid by a charter school.
Okay.
So I mean, his revenue was accurate.
Okay.
And I mean, he was working with Andy. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add that to that too. If you see, like, look at year 1 and the total, it's about $4 million a gain. And by year 5, you're almost 600,000 as a loss. So that's really is that revenue stepping down each of those years. And that the difference between those two is about 4.6 million. So we do show the same number on this slide as it steps down.
But the overall savings
what you miss
are
is
at $10.9 million.
right. What you miss is if you look at this every single year for the first 4 years, you are saving money for the district. And just like when you decide to use one-time funds, whether it's fund balance or bond debt money, whatever it is, sometimes you're buying space and time for the legislature to fix education funding. And it's not that you've put something in place that permanently fixes something. You're giving the legislature time The other thing is it keeps getting lost. And I appreciate Mr. Higgins' comments earlier. It keeps getting lost that even if it was all cost neutral in an organization as large as ours, if you're trying to create efficiencies for the education for students, you probably would consolidate schools either way, because those efficiencies also can provide a better learning outcome and better learning environment for students. Not every single student, every single day, but efficiencies are real. And we talked through what a one-section school means. And Mark has gone through this numerous times about everything from a first-year teacher in a one-section grade, where now they're picking up a combo and they're still learning out how to be a first-year teacher at one grade. And now they have a combo. There's all these other efficiencies that if you're looking for one thing to say, we absolutely can't do this because I found one thing that is less than overwhelmingly positive, you can always find one thing. But it's really the whole picture.
You have a follow-up?
The follow-up that is really more of a follow-up to Member Holloman's, I guess, line of questioning is, I was interested in Mr. Bingham's descriptions of the early childhood hubs in the Pacific Northwest and began to pursue that a little bit further. And what I found were some really exciting models where there are multiple partners brought into these hubs. You have health organizations, you have dental providers, you have social services, family literacy is a component, and there are multiple agencies coming together. To what extent is that possible in what you're talking about? Because I feel like I haven't heard of a true hub. I've heard of, and I apologize for a blasé reference, but it's like the Costco warehouse model, right? You've got a lot of kids all hubbed together, but I don't hear this interdisciplinary hub, which I think does sound really exciting.
Yeah, I agree. That is really exciting. I think that there are opportunities for that. Where we would start would be to get our classrooms into these centers versus a hub title, I would say. And the center would start with the classrooms, with the efficiencies for the related services providers, and then to look at what other outside agencies can support that. We already collaborate with Head Start. Would we be able to collaborate more? There might be some opportunity for UAA to come in with classes in early childhood, host their classes there and have on-site practicum. And then you could have community providers as well. Just kind of depends on how many classrooms and how much space and what's available or what that need is. I think that's a really good opportunity as well for the Anchorage community, depending on the location of the centers. So I don't feel like that's not something that we could pursue over kind of a long-term goal for those.
Okay, let's continue. We haven't even gotten to the performer yet.
One thing.
Go on, Member Higgins.
I just want to respond to the efficiency thing because I want to be sure I'm not pushing efficiency. If I wanted efficiency, let's just take down walls and put 60 kids in every classroom. Then we can say we're being efficient, we're cutting the cost. I want whatever decisions we make is tied to academic outcomes success of the kids. So if parents' involvement in small schools work, if a bigger school works better, but there are challenges to both sides. What we're hearing from the parents is you're pushing us away from the schools, you're pushing us out of the involvement with the kids, and they think that's not best for their kids' outcome. I respect that. They may be right, they may be wrong. I'm not trying to draw a conclusion, but I just want to say that the use of efficiency to say we're basing our decisions on the dollars and not the children's outcomes is my concern, is that this Saturday will be focused more, but that's really what I'm trying to come from.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Member Higgins. Please, Dr. Bryant.
Yeah, may I just quickly respond to Member Higgins? Thank you very much for that feedback. We want to reiterate that in addition to the financial benefits to any reduction that we're proposing, that we're also looking for opportunities to improve academic outcomes. And I think an important thing that the board is going to have to weigh are the trade-offs. Of course, there's value to keeping a neighborhood school in the neighborhood, But because of our decreased enrollment, I'm seeing way too many combination classrooms that one could also argue are inhibiting full academic progress of students. So that's really the difficult decision and trade-off that we'll have to weigh. We don't have the answers today, but going into Saturday, that's what I want to start talking about.
Thank you, sir. Continue, please.
So we wanted to go through the pro forma memo and the fund balance projections, but kind of leading up to that, I want to discuss some high level changes that would have happened in FY23 that we expect to carry over to FY24. The first one is increased overall revenue for FY23. It's about 3.1 million, predominantly driven by increases in correspondence students and intensive needs students. So as we go into looking at next year's pro forma and the projections, we've used the same enrollment as we had in the OASIS count this year because we just don't have our by school, by grade level projections from our demographer yet. We did get a district-wide summary maybe an hour ago that we're pretty close to what we have now. So I don't think it'll be materially different than what we show you here, but it may change a little bit as we go forward. We did reduce some overall expenditures in FY23 that will continue in the FY24 budget. Having high number of vacancies, it's not something we want, but frankly, it's something that's likely to continue and probably will nationwide. There was an increased number of folks who declined medical benefits this year, and expect that to probably go forward as well. It's kind of unclear why they declined those. Maybe it's just the employee contribution, but in the middle of a pandemic, I wouldn't have thought that, frankly, we would have more people waiving their medical benefits. SRO funding, the mayor has included that in the city's budget. The city's approved that. So I think we're sitting good there. So we're not going to pay that either this year or projected paying for next year. So that's kind of something where we won't spend it this year. So we'll have that money to roll forward to next year, and we can eliminate that line item in the budget for next year. So about a $4.6 million swing between those two categories. We do have increased costs and substitutes. Most of that's due to vacancies, increased cost in healthcare. It's just that inflation on medical costs continues to just go up and up. And then we'll increase our attrition estimates based on the large number of vacancies. So overall, it's about $7 million or so. The other thing is a lot of those things, the increased number of vacancies and those waiving medical insurance flows through to our ESSER funds that we had nearly 500 people or employees, FTE, in the ESSER funding. So a lot of those remain vacant and waiving medical insurance. There's a couple other smaller things. District assessment costs were lower than we had projected, and mental health funds will likely not be spent up to the full $5 million that the board had authorized. So I think we'll have, in addition to the almost $10 million that we had described back in July, we think we'll have another 9 or 10 million or so to carry forward to FY24. So about $19 million of changes that will be applied to the FY24 deficit. So at this point, I kind of wanted to spend a few minutes and just walk through how the pro forma memo and the appendix to that is laid out. What you see in front of you now is the chart in the pro forma memo. So what we have really asked for you to do is we show you the anticipated revenue by fund. This chart doesn't really show the deficit, but just how much our revenue might be for our upper limit spending authority. Typically, this may change. So as we get our demographic projections, it'll be a little bit different. Or if the board, we talk about adding more fund balance to this, this upper limit will change. But this is the basic thing you're approving in the memo as our upper limit revenue assumptions. Is there any questions on that before we dig into the actual appendix?
I don't see any.
Okay, great. Thank you. So really, this pro forma memo is to update the board on here's what we think our revenue is going to be for next year, our enrollment projections, which again, we don't quite have yet, and then our salary benefit changes and other kind of cost drivers that are going to affect what our budget is going to be next year. We'll talk about shifting the ESSER grant expenditures back to the general fund, and then seeing what we have left in the ESSER money. And then last, it does provide a 6-year outlook based on current law and flat funding thereafter. And if we get to that, I'd like to go through that a little bit, but frankly, that's only for the general fund and doesn't account for the use of ESSER funds. So kind of take that with a grain of salt where you should be adding back in the FTE from those ESSER funds. But just kind of scrolling through here, the main components are going to be based on enrollment and revenue. Enrollment drives our revenue. About 97% or so of all revenue comes from either state or local sources. So as we go through there, that OASIS count that we received in October provided, we were about 97 students above projection. So pretty close to what we actually projected. But that was a decline of about 139 regular ADM students, which would be in brick and mortar schools, 236 increase in correspondence students, and 44 students increased with intensive needs. So those changes and those enrollment drivers are really what makes up that 3.1 million we described earlier. The current law we base this on is what's in statute for the base student allocation, set as 5,960 for next year. The table on the next page, as we scroll through, it just shows the calculations, how the funding formula works. I believe we've gone through that all with you guys a few times, so don't really want to spend a whole lot of time going through this. But the big thing to note on here would be line 10 is the hold harmless provision. That goes away for FY24, and that's the difference between the FY20 school size adjusted ADM versus the current adjusted ADM at 25%. So first it was like 50% or 75%, step down to 50, then 25 for the third year, the hold harmless. So next year that goes away. So we are losing revenue from the hold harmless adjustment. So with that, we add in the three columns, should have started that is the first column is the adopted FY23 budget, what we projected for the current year. The second column is the current, what actually happened, and the third column is what we're projecting for next year. So the second and third column match on terms of ADM because we don't have our demographic projections yet, with the exception of that hold harmless coming out and the increase to 5960 in the BSA. Is there any questions on the enrollment as I go through there? Just kind of break this up by section, let you guys so don't get too lost.
So the extra $30 we got from the legislators that's not in here.
That's for next year.
That's for next year.
Right, but it is in the dollar calculation for next year.
Okay.
So as we go through the revenue projections, we're projecting about a little under $15 million more than what we had budgeted for the current year in the general fund. However, that does include the $16.1 million the board has already authorized as use of fund balance from the one-time funds that we received this year. The local revenue, as we go through there, this is one thing we talked about with at the joint meeting. The biggest thing here is the increase in the required local contribution, about $7.7 million based on the property tax values from calendar year 22. So as those went up from 21 to 22, so goes up our required local contribution. And that has a direct effect on state funding, which goes down by $7.7 million also. So there's just kind of that corollary there. That's the biggest thing for local funding. There's about 121,000 or so that'll go down for the additional allowable contribution as our as that base is kind of reset with that hold harmless going away. A couple other ones. E-rate is going to go up by a little bit. Interest earnings, we expect those to stay about the same. It's been a fairly volatile market, as you probably know. Most of our funds are invested in a mark-to-market type accounts where we book the value of those investments each month. But the federal funds rate, which we also have cash holdings, has gone up from 0.25% a year ago up to about 4% now. So we are earning more money with the cash we have in the bank. However, those investments are up and down. So we don't really have a good idea or a firm projection of being able to increase or decrease the $2 million or so that we have budgeted for interest earnings now. We do anticipate using that $16.1 million that the board has said to carry over from this year for the one-time money going forward. And then for the state revenue, we discussed that. I kind of broke it down in a few different ways here. if you look at how the change in state revenue stacks up, the hold harmless reduction was about a 6.4 million decrease in funding. The $30 BSA increase results in about $2.7 million increase. And then our overall enrollment change is about 3.1 million. So there are those, that really makes up the change in state revenue. Federal revenue consisting primarily of federal impact aid, and ROTC funding and Medicaid funding. We do anticipate our federal impact aid funding going down in the following year just based on declining number of students living on base. So almost all of that funding, which is kind of a payment in lieu of taxes for not being able to tax the federal lands, that money goes, as those students go down, so does the funding for them. So the overall outlook for our revenue picture is increase from about 24 million in local funds, primarily driven by the required local contribution and one-time fund balance usage. There's going to be a decline in state revenue based on some of those ancillary factors, then that required local contribution, reducing it by the 7.7 million or so. And then you see the federal impact aid. So about 14.8 million in total increase in revenue. However, without the one-time fund balance usage, it's about 2 million or so below that. Is there any questions on revenue?
Not seeing any.
All right. So our general fund, our expenditure projections are based on our current general fund staffing levels, and then increase for positions funded through our ESSER grant. So what we've done is we've added all our positions into the general fund, and that's the way we're kind of looking at our budget approach is we're going to put everything back in our general fund so we have one kind of pot to look at versus trying to bifurcate it into ESSER money and general fund. So then at the end, once we figure out how much ESSER money we'll actually have, I mean, we think it'll be around 19 million or so. We'll decide, we'll just push some extra costs into there, likely like classroom teachers or something. But really just wanted to get a firm handle on what's being included in that ESSER funding and the general fund so we can better report that out. But our expenditure projections, it's mostly salary and benefit increases for permanent staff. And then we'll add in the ESSER funded positions. But without the ESSER funded positions, the salary and benefits are expected to go up by about 1.8% in aggregate. However, the chart doesn't really show that because we have included the ESSER funded positions in there. Then it shows about an increase of about 15.5% because of all the new positions that we pulled from the other funding source. Then we'll talk about a little bit about supplies, services, and equipment costs. Typically, those make up a very small or smaller portion of our budget. So the material swing's not quite as big as what the salary and benefits is going to be. But again, you know, the inflation ties back to this. If we only budget for a 0 to 2% increase on these, we do kind of erode that purchasing power that we have for our school-based funding. So our general fund staffing, I won't spend a lot of time on that. It's because it really just reflects what we've done, what's happening this year carried forward to next year. If you look at it by state function on this table, we've just moved by function, the FY23 stimulus funded positions up into the general fund, just to see how many. So it'd be same 5,150 FTE that we have currently between those two funding sources. Is there any questions on staffing?
I think you said this, but does the staffing include the positions that we funded with ESSER money, one-time funding last year?
Yes, ma'am. So on the FY23 column, you'll see how they're broken out by function between general fund and stimulus funding. So then for FY24, we've just moved those up.
Those right over.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Questions? All right, let's keep going. You're percolating.
All right. So typically projecting the personnel salaries, we just take what's in the current contracts and apply those to what our wages are. Right now we have AEA, Totem, ACE, and the bus drivers in attendance. Those bargaining groups have settled contracts through the end of FY24 or later. So we know what those ones are. AP principals, custodians, food service, and maintenance bargaining groups have contracts that have have expired at this point or will be expired by the time FY24 starts. So just kind of break that out. We do put in some cost increased for that just to have a better scope of what that deficit might be. So table 4, we wanted to really show just kind of where that ARP staff is and how much it costs. So this is really what our spending plan is for full-time staff. We'll have another chart like this for kind of more addenda or non-full-time staffing and then other stuff. But as we go through that, there's also added duty and extra help. Typically, these costs go up. The rates are tied to bargaining groups. So it's kind of split between some of the addenda rates are set in the AEA contract, or a lot of them are, and they're going to be flat for those 3 years, but some of them are tied to per diem wages. So those would increase. So about an aggregate of about maybe 1% increase between those kind of added duty and extra help funding. The things we pulled into the general fund for other wages that are not tied directly to full-time employees, summer school, reading support, tech support, subs for the ESER funded teachers, and some substitute training. So another $6 million or so that's pulled in from non-FTE. Substitute costs, we expect those to go up. I put in 10%. We've been using, as we look at our fund balance projections, we're going to be considerably over budget by a lot more than 10%. However, that's directly tied to the vacancies. So as those vacancies are higher, we expect our subs cost to be higher. So it's really kind of hard to predict what our sub usage is going to be if we were to start being able to fill some of these positions.
I see a hand. Member Holloman.
I am wondering if the administration sees having to raise the daily rate for substitutes in the near future.
I would suspect so. I don't know when the last time that rate was done. I believe it's still $150 a day, and it's been quite a while. So the 10% could be reflective of just being able to increase that daily rate too.
So the ESSER money that you talked about in table 5, that summer school amount, that is, we have to spend that amount on summer school.
No, not
was that a restriction? No.
Not necessarily, no.
All right, thank you.
That's just how much we had planned to in the current year. So.
Okay.
One-time payments. This is one of the other things that'll come out. The teacher's contract had a large, or I guess in total terms of total dollars, bonus within there that was going to be paid out in 23. That's not going to be in there for 24. So you'll see these one-time payments go down. It's for the FY24s. But we'll show that when we get to the chart. Medical coverage continues to be it's about 17% of our general fund expenditures. It's a pretty big cost driver, and the costs just keep going up. Those are set by the bargaining group contracts for the most part. So we will be, a lot of that will be changed like when some of these contracts settle. But we do expect that to continue to go up. And really, it's really kind of been trouble to mitigate with those cost increases. The attrition and vacancy rates, those are ones that continues to be also hard to predict. We had 450, 500 vacancies between all our funding sources the last time I pulled that. So we continue to see really high vacancies and savings there. So to some extent, we have this attrition offset in our budget, which is a negative number that allows us to put more money in other places based on our projection of vacancies. I'm going to increase those by about 1 for salary by about 11% and benefits by another 8 or 9%. Kind of get nervous trying to chase that. I'm generally budget these fairly conservatively, but as long as you get a little nervous trying to chase those attrition rates too high, at some point you're going to hire those people and my attrition rate's going to be high and I'll end up being over budget. That's really not what we want to see. So you will see an increase in those attrition rates. And then other benefits, those typically track whatever other cost drivers in the contracts are. So if our contract goes up by, if wages go up by 2% on classified employees, you'd expect to see Social Security going up by the same 2%. So our total general fund, salaries, wages, benefits, this is the table laid out here. We separate it by state function, and then at the end add in the ESSER money that you saw above, the full-time staffing. The other payroll outlays, also an ESSER money on line 19, and then we calculate the benefits on that as well. So really not a lot of outliers on here. They're all fairly settled contracts with some projection in for the ones that are unsettled. Although I believe the unsettled contracts don't make up a significant portion of the budget. So if they settle for something different than the rough projection we throw in here, it shouldn't be a huge sway in the budget deficit. So you see the 10% in substitutes in line 15. Line 18, you'll see those one-time payments that I spoke of for the AEA contract coming out. And then you can see the salary and attrition numbers, about $770,000 additional for salary and another $1.5 million for benefits. Truthfully, we may be able to chase those up higher, again, but it kind of makes me a little bit nervous as we're somewhat conservative in our budgeting and certainly don't want to be over budget at the end of the year. So about $73 million in general fund increases once we pull in all that ESSER funded items. So about 15.5%. Is there any question on the staffing and funding for that?
Not seeing any.
Okay. So moving on, most of the other personnel services it's about 14% of the district's budget. I've tied those to about 1.5% increases. There's a few things that are outliers. Overall, the utilities budget's projected to go up by about 1.3 million or about 6.5%. Most notably, it's going to be heating costs, about 18%. So from FY21 the FY22 budget to FY23, we actually dropped our heating budget, but the price of natural gas has gone up a little bit, and we expect that to go back up to more historical levels. Electric will be fairly similar to what 1.5% is what we're projecting. But again, without the commodity prices change dictates how much the fuel usage. That one's always been kind of hard to project. And then whatever the regulatory approvals are going to be for those, for maybe the ops and maintenance side of those utilities. The other thing we're expecting to see is an increase in the cost of activity busing. It's not in terms of dollars, a huge amount, but in percentage, just due to the cost of fuel and labor within our transportation pool. Most supplies and equipment are going to be about 1.5% growth. Put in 12% for fuel. Cost of gas is going up. We will reevaluate that as it looks like it's coming down again. But it's about 60,000. So again, not a huge variance within our total budget. General liability changes. Those are our insurance costs. Those have been going up by, some years it was 40%, other years 10%. We're anticipating 10 to 15% again this year as a placeholder. That one's, again, also kind of hard to predict where the market's going to land. And we generally, we used to be able to get our insurance in place around April, March, April, and now we're getting it in place towards end of June, early July. So being able to find the insurance and have good rates on that is getting increasingly difficult. Lastly, again, the SROs, they were included in the 23 budget. We're going to back those out because the muni's picking up the cost of those. So thank the Assembly and the Mayor for coming together and providing that relief to us. That's a pretty big swing. So other ongoing ESSER stimulus funded costs that we included in our general fund projections. The mental health, we think we can spend another $2 million or so next year. The IT equipment software that we've been purchasing out of there, Chromebooks, and then the learning software. There's a number of things in there, about 4.4 million. College career life readiness initiatives for meet board goals, graduation support, and technology and or summer school, which is mostly transportation for summer school and a few supplies, and then the training inclusive practices, the training for inclusive practices, I guess. So, is there any questions on that?
Let's go.
All right. So now we're going to roll down to what you probably really want to know is what the actual budget deficit calculated is. So right now it's sitting at about $67 million. However, that does not include the approximately $19 million in remaining Easter stimulus funding that we're going to projecting to have available to offset some of these costs. So that gets down about 48 million. We'll walk through that again here once we get to the next section of PowerPoint slides. Check my time. So transportation, we did our projected revenue is about $20 million or so from the state, based on the $481 per student that we received in FY16. So having to eat inflation, and then more recently, really high inflation to be able to just get our kids to school, having to increase wages, increase fuel. It's taken a toll on our transportation budget, but we're not going to be able to educate kids unless they're at school. That's the bottom line. That's the first step to educating students. So I'll scroll down quickly, kind of got a lot more stuff to get through here today. But really it's the staffing level or current staffing levels, the wage and benefit increases through the contract we settled, and then the contracted transportation services to help get their wages in line. And there's going to be an increase there too, and they're tied to inflation as well.
Madam President, can I ask a question about transportation over here? Does this assume that no change to school start times and any savings that might be realized from that?
That's correct. This doesn't assume changes to levels of service. So I'll scroll down to what the budget gap is here. The city has provided about $5.6 million for the current year to help shore up our transportation fund. The amount of funding needed from local sources, whether it's general fund contributions or property taxes, continue to go up over the years. So we see about a $2.4 million deficit in our transportation. And this is assuming the city will continue to support the same level of property tax relief that we've had in the current year. That could be, could change, because we did increase the required local contribution, and the city has a tax cap as well. So we just need to work with the city and see to make sure we can collect that, but just know that that one could change. And then we might have additional fund balance from savings this year within our transportation fund that we can help offset that deficit, but we don't have that projection quite ready yet. Is there any questions on the transportation fund?
Not seeing any.
Okay, so the debt service fund, we'll go through these really quickly because these are self-supporting funds, so we're not going to record a deficit in them. We will expect a decline in our debt service fund based on our current payments, about 15.6% decline. And it's mostly due to a refunding bond that we issued, I think back in 2010. We had $10 million lower payment next year than we did this year, essentially, on the payment schedule for that one refunding bond. We are going to go out to sale. We're going out to sale now for a bond for December. So that will change a little bit. And then whatever we project to sell next year will be in there. But again, that's going to be tax revenue and state revenue that's self-supporting. So it won't be any sort of contributions from other funding sources. Food service, same thing. It's self-supported, increased the revenue and expenditures by about 1.6 million, go up by about 7% based on changes to the federal reimbursement rates and the number of meals sold. Our grant funding, you'll see that is a decrease in the memo, predominantly because we've spent out our ARP money for the most part and will not be spending as much of it next year. Capital projects funds, I did put quite a bit of money into there for the upper limit authority because of the board memo, I believe it was 24, that allocated the school bond debt reimbursement to a variety of capital projects. It does not include the remaining $37.7 million that you guys are going to vote on tonight. But just to have that upper limit authority to be able to spend the money that the board's allocated, essentially. Because the muni does cap, we have to, are holding how much there is a spending cap that we set and the muni sets with us. So, and then the last, student activities is on similar $6 to $8 million range that we anticipate. And that's all self-supported by fundraising or donations to those funds. So overall, it's a better picture than we showed before, mostly due to increased vacancies and having a little bit of Easter money left over, a little bit increased revenue, and a couple like big items that we showed on decreases in expenditures. I will let you look at, this is the 6-year outlook. And again, you can kind of take that with a grain of salt because there's over 500 positions that aren't shown in here that are currently being ESSER funded. We were trying to look at a model that would incorporate those, but did not have time to have get it reviewed and vetted and have it make sense. So, but that is out there if there's any questions on the 6-year plan or any of the other funds. Okay.
That's many.
I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint here. So again, just kind of to recap this, the original deficit from July was about 68 million, including whatever the projected enrollment was for FY23. We've updated that for the actual enrollment. Then there's some big cost drivers that we've taken out. So the 2.3 million for the SROs, the one-time payments from the teacher's contract, the increase to the attrition estimate, and then everything else adds up to about 500,000, including, other changes in revenues and other changes in expenditures. So again, $3 million in increased enrollment, and then additional 9 million or so in unused ESSER money that'll be rolled over. So that gets our deficit that we still need to make up to about 48 million. So a better picture than the 68 million, hopefully was able to explain why those changes occurred, really with 3 or 4 or 5 big items there. Is there any questions on this?
Member Wilson. Has ASD received all of the FEMA reimbursements? Or is that still in progress?
No, and I'll address that a little bit in the fund balance projections. When the auditor came up and we had to make a last minute adjustment on our financial statements, what happened is we did include almost $10 million in additional FEMA revenue into our general fund. So we will see that backed out because that's not real. We've repaid our general fund for the most part. So that money is really due back to our capital projects fund and for the board to reallocate towards their kind of capital priorities for the FEMA funding. But we have not received all of it by any stretch, I don't believe.
Okay. Member Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm going off of memory, but I believe that the original 67 million deficit from July included the assumption that the 16 million one-time state funds would be allocated to the deficit by that down, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Were there other one-time state or ESSER funding allocations that brought that down even further? And if so, could you remind me what the original deficit was prior to one-time funds?
So it would have been the 68 million. There was about the 16 million for trying to do math in my head. That's going to get up to 84 million. And then about 10 million in one-time funding from ESSER that was included in that initial projection.
Okay.
Did I do that wrong? No, I'm trying to think of math. Don't like doing math here on the spot. So you want to do the fund balance? Sure. Back one slide and just do it. All right. So now we'll walk through the fund balance projections. So to really show how much money you think we might have remaining at the end of the year to be able to allocate towards this remaining $48 million deficit. And again, kind of the structural deficit there we show is about 67 million once you kind of discount some of those one-time funds. So going forward here, on the revenue side of our projections, our student fees are going to be down by about 620,000. That's predominantly due to waiving parking fees while we didn't have busing service. There's been lower participation in activities, and we're projecting a little bit lower revenue from tuition payments associated with the Lower Yukon partnership with King Tech. Note though that with less revenue and Lower Yukon, there are also fewer costs associated with it. So if the revenue goes up, the costs are going to go up. It shouldn't materially affect what the projections are. Interest earnings right now about 200,000 more than we're expecting. However, that could change in a given month, as we've had $1 million swings up and down already this year. The other local revenue is about 2.7 million. It shows in the deficit. However, 2.8 million of that is, or almost 2.9 million of it is fund balance usage. So when the board approved memo number 24, about 2.8 million went into the general fund as a usage of fund balance, because we transferred money in just to keep our budgets in balance. We have to have our revenues equal our expenditures. So we had that we transferred the money in and included as a usage of fund balance. The foundation funding, $19.1 million increase, and that's reflective of about the $16 million in additional one-time funds and the $3 million or so of additional enrollment-related increases with intensive needs in the correspondence students. Federal impact aid, that's been trending downward. Part of this is hard to project for the federal impact aid. It's they don't pay us the full amount that school districts are due up front. They pay maybe 50 or 60% of their local opportunity threshold. And then sometimes they'll give you that money in the current year. Sometimes they'll make up from prior years. So it hadn't been a clear pattern of when we receive this federal impact money, especially when they're trying to close out these old years. So that could go up or down depending on how much they pay us for the current application and how much they actually repay us from the prior applications that once those get closed out. And then the last kind of big one would be the $2 million in the Emergency Connectivity Fund. This is a federal reimbursement for our hardware, including Chromebooks and lease devices that we have, I think up to $400 or so per device. So that's something we didn't plan on doing it, but our IT folks worked with the Emergency Connectivity Fund. I guess it runs through the same folks at the E-rate, but did the application, we got the money, so that was good news, and that'll help go towards our fund balance. So overall, about almost $3 million or 3% above our initial projection revenue. It's about 16.6 million. Any questions on the revenue side? All right, on the expense side, as we go through there, the district administration, professional and technical are both under budget largely due to vacancies. Some of those vacancies have been held open as we try and anticipate if we can make reductions to these positions. So purposely not filling these right away to see if we can structurally change what our departments are doing to try to find some efficiencies there within our administration. Clerical costs, those are running pretty close to historical averages. And then you see teachers' assistants here, about 3.9 million, almost 18% under, just largely just vacancies within our special education teaching assistants. Those positions continue to be hard to fill. And you'll see kind of an offset, like when you look down at this added duty extra help, that's where the substitutes or the people coming in to help try to backfill the teacher's assistants are coded. So you'll see that one a little bit over budget, but we are certainly not being able to make up the actual loss in those teaching assistant positions. Similar case for substitutes and certificated teachers. So right now it's about $6.5 million or so over budget, or about 100% in subs. And we still have, issues with classroom coverage. We have a lot of vacancies, trying to make those up, but and we have a lot of long-term subs within here trying to cover those classrooms. Overall, there is a savings between the two categories, but, frankly, it's probably not exactly what we want to see as far as helping out with educational outcomes. So those are the main points within the other category. That's predominantly leave for employees, and then some other like safety, security, noon duty type employees are in there. 1.1 million or so under budget. So overall, about $5 million under budget in our salaries and wages, about 1.5% off from our initial budget. Benefits, the big item there is the $21 million you'll see in savings in the medical. This year, we had about 900 people between all funds waive insurance. It's about 200 more than we had in the previous year. There's a lot more folks waiving insurance than what we had projected. So that's where you see savings there. And a lot of this is also vacancies and turnover too. So as we see folks who come in and, you know, work for a period of time but don't trigger medical benefits, it doesn't necessarily get credited into or expensed at that time. Other benefits really just kind of track the other vacancies that we've had throughout the rest of the budget. Kind of big other things you'll see going down to services. Utilities will be a little bit under budget maybe, and that's kind of going to be weather dependent. If we have a cold winter, that could certainly change, or if regulatory commodity prices, those change, you know, we'll look at those as we go. But right now we're projecting about $1 million under budget. A few dollars in rent and leases and travel that we just had less travels. People still aren't necessarily getting out as much as they used to or they had planned to. Some of that's vacancy related. You know, if there's a lot of work to do, we have vacancies we're trying to cover from people and can't necessarily go to as many places as you want. The unallocated account. So that's one that pops out as a negative 2.8 million. So in a lot of these vacancies and this attrition number is charter schools. So they also have issues not being able to hire their positions. And at the end of the year, when their money remains unspent, we pull it up and they encumber it and carry it over. So this account is, the budget in here is predominantly reflective of all the money that charter schools have carried forward. There's a little bit for districts and summer school stuff in there, but almost the entirety of that is charter schools. So what we did as far as the actuals, we increased that by, you know, 3.5 million or so for the anticipation of charter schools being able to capture their vacancy savings and carry those forward as well. Although we didn't adjust the budget because we don't really know where those savings are or exactly what line those savings are going to come from. But we do anticipate them being able to carry over their portion of funds also. So that's most of the services. Everything else is really just kind of tracking what we would generally expect. You know, no one ever spends all their supply money. Our general liability insurance claims, we expect those to be within $100,000 or so of what we projected. And then the other expenditures is the big one, the 2.3 million of that is the SRO costs. So from that, about almost $17 million in savings on the expense side, about 2.75% or so. From that expense side, we're also going to transfer out, kind of look at this area here, about $13 million in transfers to other funds. As I mentioned with the FEMA money, that money came in as revenue at the end of last year, recorded at the end of last year and carried forward into our unallocated fund balance. But we do want to reflect that as coming out and transferring out to our capital projects fund. So all that to say, time check here. It's our revenue over expenditures is about $26 million or so when you take into account the 16 or so increase in revenue, the under budget and expenditures, and then those transfers out. And then from that, there's about, you know, almost $8 million in changes in designated fund balance, which we record this as designated and undesignated fund balances. The designated that's changing here is encumbrances. So as the charter schools carry over those funds, we talked about 3.5 million or so, we expect it to be encumbered and go against what these designated fund balances are. And then the rest of that's going to be predominantly within federal impact aid, as we're expecting to designate a little bit more fund balance for that. And that's more of probably a different work session to talk about how those fund balances all work together, because those get a little more complicated. But at the end of the day, you know, we're looking at, you know, right now, before the use of that $16 million in fund balance, about 15.8% carryover. And that is the amount of undesignated fund balance, which includes that 16 million, divided into the projected expenditures for the district. So that's how they do the 10% calculation at the state level. And then you see in the red here is we wanted to show you how much is available per board policy. So right now, the minimum board policy is 8%, and that's about $44 million. Back out the 16 million that you've already committed for that to be held against next year's budget. We have about $28 million between our projected fund balance and that 8% board minimum. That some or all of that could be designated by the board to help offset some of the costs for next year. So that's what I have for fund balance.
That's of the 28 million.
The 28 million, yeah.
Okay. Questions? Okay.
Okay, so I modified this fiscal cliff chart. You'll notice that we included the $16 million, which is about a 221 BSA equivalent for use of fund balance and some other dollars, and also updated with the ESSER rollover of the 9 million and added that up. And so if you look at the stacked bar chart, $48 million is about $377 in BSA equivalent. But here's the dilemma on this chart, and this is the dilemma the board will be working through over the next several weeks, is the more one-time funds you put against this and don't make reductions in any other areas across the district. If you look to the right, the structural deficit remains at $860 BSA equivalent. So you could put more fund balance towards this. You could do a lot of things to include the state bond debt reimbursement, but unless there are structural reductions in the district, the deficit really will be the same, only with one more year of inflationary costs, which is about 10 to 12 million when you're going into FY25. And to Mr. Donnelly's point, now that I just said that, I think you're right. I need to make the chart go to FY25, but this is the dilemma, right? And I'll hand over to Mark if you go through the next chart. So we've reset the bar because of the 9 million in ESSER, the 16 million, down at $48 million, and of course the revenue adjustments. So we're starting point at 48 million, and Mark wants to walk you through the process we'll go through this coming Saturday. So Mark, next slide, please.
So thank you, Jim. So the next two slides just show some of the buckets, or whatever you want to call them, tools that we've talked about to try to, as he's called it, get to zero. Like, how do we get a balanced budget, which is the statutory obligation we have, is to present a balanced budget to you in February. So on Saturday at our retreat, just want to get you to wrap your heads around this a little bit. Dr. Bryant kicked us off by talking about that this would be a conceptual activity, a conceptual exercise. It is not a decision. It's not decisional. But what it really will be is we've taken all the things that have been briefed with you since July, and all the different activities, cut this, add this fund, that fund. What we're going to do is, and I'd like you to go to not the next slide, but the very last one, that one right there. So our print shop is producing a big poster that you'll see on the right-hand side. And this poster that you're each going to have at a table is going to show 4 buckets or boxes. One of them is going to say using one-time funds. Your one-time funds consist of the $37 million in bond reimbursement dollars, and also the fund balance projections that have been briefed tonight and upped based on the latest data we have. And those would be examples of things that could be spent once. What you'll see on the right is another section called reducing expenditures. And some of those that are in those little cards you see there, some of those are in red. Those would be reductions, things that we have proposed to you as possibilities that would be cutting expenditures. And then at the bottom of the chart, you'll see two other things. One says off the table, which would be if there's a particular reduction that in your world you believe is off the table for you, something that you just do not want to consider, then that's where that ticket would go. There's another one called parking lot, which is I'm unsure. And none of these things are things that would be permanent. Basically, it's the concept of you trying to get to zero, to put together the combination. And so as you're thinking about this between now and Saturday we'll go into much detail about all of those little pieces. But for now, I would like you to just be wrapping your heads around where each of you stand philosophically. So think of it like this. There are shorter term decisions that we can make, and that would consist of using all your one-time funds and resources, and perhaps that deficit for 1 year is gone by the use of one-time funds. But like Jim has briefed, if we do that and there isn't a change at the state level, and there isn't something coming that rescues us, then what that means is kick the can down 1 more year. And then starting in July, we will have even more robust conversations about a larger deficit than what we had this year. So that's the shorter term solutions. You might think of it as longer term solutions, which is cutting your way to a balanced budget. That might not be palatable to you either. And then there's that in the middle, which is probably where some of you will land, which was some kind of a hybrid approach. Some things you want to reduce, other things you want to apply one-time funds to. And what we'll do Saturday, none of this is decisional, but if the board can start to find common ground on where you stand on your approaches, I think it will make it a little easier for you to understand. And the purpose of doing this is for you to use those cards and move them around and start to say, this is how I see the world, and then talk to your colleagues and just see where you stand. It's not, there's no tracking of each person's personal thinking on this. There's no, we're not asking you to walk out with a decision individually or collectively. Right. It's an exercise for you to wrap your head around this, because what happens for staff is we have to take all these philosophies of where we believe you're leaning, and we have to put them into the 600-page budget book that takes everything Andy just briefed you in well, not even great detail for Andy, but for us, it's great detail, right? But you see how complex all this is. What we need is a direction. We need you to point us north or south or west or something, so we can begin to craft what that budget recommendation is actually going to be. So that's a summary of Saturday, and staff will facilitate that. We'll be there to answer questions. And there's also some cards that you'll have that are blank that are called wild cards, which would be if you're proposing something that administration has not made a recommendation out of, then we'll be here with our computers and we'll do our best to look into whatever you might be proposing that hasn't been thoughtfully put out by this group in the last 6 months. So that's what we'll do Saturday, and hopefully it'll be engaging. And I will say none of this will be fun, but hopefully you'll see what we're actually doing. And I want to close with one more thing. Member Lessons had mentioned the concept of she mentioned PTR in particular, and you talked about layering. So the way these cards will be written, you could put one, say a PTR of 1 for K-12, and then you mentioned layering another one on top of maybe a different grade level. So we'll have that capacity as well. So that's the rough agenda for Saturday.
Okay. And in addition, like the idea that Andy brought up tonight, we'll be able to bring, relative to the pre-K, putting pre-K in current buildings, short of closing them, would that be part of the discussion?
Well,
as a new idea. I don't know if it's a wild card, but
no, but I'll get together with Chelsea and staff, and we'll take a look at that.
Member Lessons?
Well, you do that anyway, Mr. Holland. I'm imagining we'll find several crazy ideas, but that's the whole idea, is to try to put it all together and have you see how we get to zero.
Yes. Member Lessons. I was going to say, I think you've got 7 wild cards up here already. But I was curious, I don't see any, I see the dome rental as one of the options, but I don't see, like we've heard about potential swimming and hockey. I mean, everything is small in relation to the magnitude of this entire deficit, but I don't see specific
So the
rental.
the pieces that are in front of you, I want you to realize these are in draft format, and then we're still fine tuning a few of the numbers that are going to shift between now and Wednesday. And then I'll have a final set of those cards and we'll go through. And yes, I was looking through that too. Jim put these together on the weekend.
So maybe these are representatives.
The biggest reason that we put the dome is it's not tied to the success of any sport. In fact, we're the only district in the entire state that has a dome, and yet every other district still manages to do track and field and soccer, if they have soccer teams. But the reason that we didn't put the ice time and the swim time is we talked about it being a 2 to 3 year outsourcing option, where the first year you're working with the local community, looking for stakeholders who may be interested or not. We don't know until we start trying to look at that sport for outsourcing. So we would not have reduced ice time or swim time as we're looking for an outsourcing partner. When female hockey was outsourced, it took 3 years. In the first year, the district covered the whole cost as they finally found somebody to start that outsourcing process. The second year, they weren't fully viable, so the district paid a portion of it. And all of these things are going to be months of discussions with multiple potential partners before finding the partners that we settle in on, if it's even possible. We don't know that we can outsource those sports until we start trying. And so when we asked for permission to move forward, that's really where we're at. And so we don't have a timeline for outsourcing until we find a partner.
So I think all the contracts need to be on here, though. I think if we are, I see value in the dome. It was never part of my understanding that we would cut the dome's budget. I mean, the dome's contract, that we would look at it as part, maybe renegotiating it or something. It was never my understanding that we would cut any of the contracts completely, but that there were savings possible there. This makes it appear as if we are absolutely, that is an option to just cut the dome contract without.
Well, it is an option. The current contract with the dome expires at the end of this year. So it is a legitimate option. It doesn't mean that that's what the board will want to do, right? I mean,
So will we know on Saturday the possible outsource options, or will we just be still
negative? Okay. We still have to find community partners, work through over the next several months to find out, is there anyone out there even willing to help us outsource gymnastics, swimming, or hockey? If it comes back that we can't even find partners who are willing to start the conversations, then my guess would be that we would be talking about these on 1 July next year, especially if the legislature has not fixed the BSA as potential future discussions in a different way.
Okay. Member Jacobs.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. Now I can talk about this more on Saturday, but I guess I'm curious, especially the hockey and the swimming brought it up, but potentially after some of the feedback we received at town halls, maybe relabeling the parking lot at some point or after the activity's finished as FY25 reductions or an FY25 shortlist. That way we're getting that data out there as quickly as possible, both to legislators and the community, that we were able to do XYZ this year, and next year these reductions are already on our top of mind. So
Other comments? Okay, Member Donnelly and then Member Higgins.
Can we get this slide here in a larger format before Saturday so that we can do some work with it ourselves personally? Yeah. And it'd be good too.
How many wild cards will we have?
Any as you want, but I think the deck we've been working off of had 3 in there.
Okay.
And could you also add, based on your explanations today, the targets, the updated targets?
Yes. Yeah, when we did a dry run with our cabinet just to see how this can work. It'll be confusing. It won't be perfectly, but the whole idea is to generate discussions among you about where you all are falling, because for us to approve a budget, we need a majority of the board and hopefully consensus on a way forward from you. So yes, we can, I forgot what your question was, add what?
The targets.
Oh yes, the targets. The one we did before, we used a grand total of 68 when we did our exercise. So we will take the updated estimated deficit pieces and we'll have that. And then the idea, as you can see on the chart, is come up with your one-time funds you want to use and have a total. The one-time the ongoing reducing expenditures you would agree to, and grand total is. The goal is to get that to the grand total of our deficit through the use of those 2 things. And then if there's things you're willing to talk to your colleagues about that are completely off the table for you, that you let each other know what those things in your mind and your current thinking, again, current thinking, right? This is not decisional. And then there are some things that you can think about the parking lot. And the thing I was going to brief to you on Saturday is if you put something in the parking lot, what is it you need to know before you're willing to make that decision? Like what is it you personally need to know? And then off the table, if you're willing to tell your colleagues why you feel that way, it's to generate the discussion. And so hopefully you'll find it instructive, because the detail that Andy and Jim provided to you in the pro forma, that's our work. The board's work is this bigger picture of moving these things around and giving us enough information for us to put a budget book together for you. So hopefully it will help.
Is there, will there be opportunity to just look at what the administration's recommendations, if we took them all, now I'm not saying we are, don't get me wrong, but if we started at a point of taking all of the administration's recommendations, what would that particular cost? I mean, is there an opportunity to maybe have a graph or something that shows what we would save if the board chose to? And then, because this activity will break out our individual ideas, but what if we started with the administration's recommendations? What does that look like?
I'll defer to Dr. Bryant. That is certainly the work of admin if the board's desire.
I don't want it to be cumbersome. But if we were starting at a point, it seems to me that's the point where these are the recommendations. This is the savings. Now you get to do this activity around that, because somebody might really want to take all the administration's recommendations.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And really the purpose of the exercise is to really understand what additionally does the board need to know before we can make a decision one way or another. So while the administration could, create our own chart of proposed recommendations, we understand that the board might see that and still have follow-up questions. So really we were kind of using this activity as just more of a thought exercise to get the conversation going, because really we want to get a sense as to what is the direction of the board before we provide some sort of final all-encompassing recommendation, so we can ensure that not only we're making choices that are fiscally responsible, but also ensure academic outcomes will be maintained, if not improved, as much as possible.
Okay. And my final question is, on this chart where you have the state bond debt reimbursement, that's the one-time $37 million that we're going to vote on tonight. Is that correct? Okay, just broken out in little buckets.
Yeah.
Member Lessons.
I think that I shared this earlier in the process, it would be very valuable for me to understand if there is an administrative list of, your recommendations. I'd like to understand what is the impact to student outcomes on any of these options. What's the impact to student outcomes of increasing the PTR by 1 or 3 or 5 or moving to 6th grade and losing the middle school model? And I don't know if there's a succinct way to just give us a bullet point, like this is the input and here is the possible output from each of these decisions. And that way that would help me understand what will hurt less.
Okay, so member lessons. My answer to that is that's near impossible ask. And we can provide some, like, for example, you'll notice that, and this, I'm going to come back to Mr. Higgins' responses about student outcomes on these things. So we can talk about a more effective size of an elementary school around the closures. I can explain those things. The reason we can't point to a X increase in student outcomes as measured by X test is that the amount of variables that entails is massive. I mean, it could be the quality of the principal and their ability to be an instructional leader. It could be the value of the actual teachers that are in those grade levels that are most valued by the assessment pieces. There are so many variables that come into that for me to say, if we do this, it will increase or decrease student outcomes by X. It's just not that simple. There's just, our profession has so many impacting variables that the science, we can't isolate the variables to that extent in this business. It's very complicated to do that.
Right. And just to add to Dr. Stuck's comment, while it would be difficult to, do control studies or any sort of study to definitively know causal relationships of the impact of a program, what we can do as an administration is be there to provide a high level summary of what are potential trade-offs. For example, ASDV is here, for example, and a board member may ask on Saturday, if we were to, do that differently, what would be the potential impact? So at a high level, we could, but we wouldn't be able to provide that causal relationship that you might be seeking.
Right.
Member Higgins.
Thank you. I appreciate Dr. Stock's comment, because I remember the National School Board Association puts the biggest emphasis on school outcome on the principal. So that's the results and all. So I greatly appreciate that comment right off the bat. And I also agree with the superintendent's approach that this meeting is to have an open discussion, not confrontational, on what the best outcomes are and talk about all of them, pros and cons. So that it's not we have to change your view. We want to jointly come out with it. Part of what I did request though in a committee, I just want to follow up with, is just getting an idea of what the department staffing was like in 2016 and forward. But also, I'm curious about, when was the last time we had 44,000 kids? And what was it like then? I mean, a little bit. What's going on since then that might be kind of interesting? I don't know how far back that goes. I know in 2008, when I first got on the board, we were at 49,000. So it has to go back quite a ways to be able to find that out. But at the time that they did that, if that was in the 90s, that was the time when the budget was being cut, CTE was being eliminated, all kind of things. So it's not fair to make a comparison to that, given the economics of that time. Just say that. So I'm going to drop the request for when it was 44,000, since it's going to be misleading as all like crazy. But I do want to look at every department and to go forward. And I want that also to include contract positions as well, because that's all relevant. As well, because a lot of that's the same as positions. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Roger, I have been working on that. As you're probably aware, the budget analyst and the finance analyst are Jim and Andy. A couple of years before I became the CFO, they cut both finance analysts and the budget analyst. And we're working on those products, but we're working on those products. We're going to try to get those done by Friday. But
I would just,
it's all of it, right?
I would just point out, to be of assistance with my HR background, that Andy's an exempt employee. He's working an unlimited amount of hours. So I appreciate
I can
that.
assure you, we have worked an unlimited amount of hours.
Okay, well, we are at our time, and I want to thank the administration, Mr. Anderson, Andy, Dr. Stock, everybody, just thank you for all the time. We really do recognize that we have overextended your workloads. And I haven't heard not one single complaint, but we want you to know how much we appreciate it. At this point, we'll move. I'll accept a motion to move into executive session for the purpose of contracts and legal.
Madam President, I so move.
Moved in second. Is there any opposition? All right.